As a Scotsman dedicated to the study and enjoyment of Scottish culture, it came as a complete shock to me that Beethoven had collaborated with two of our greatest writers, Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. How could this have happened? And how could it have happened without it being widely known? This I had to look into. Both premises, that it happened and that it is not widely known, are down to George Thomson, a fascinating figure who strove to usher Scots culture into all the refined music rooms of Europe. That his monumental work was largely in vain is as tragic as it is understandable. Nevertheless, the obscurity of these works by the towering figures of the international Romantic movement remains striking. Perhaps there is an ironic clue in the origin of this project. George Thomson was an Edinburgh civil servant in the late 18th century and early 19th century. He had a good income and a passion for music. As a member of the Edinburgh Musical Society, he played violin and sang in the choir, as well as eagerly attending concerts at St. Cecilia's Hall in the heart of the city. When he heard visiting Italian castrato Giusto Ferdinando Tenducci interpret Scots folk songs with passion and fashionable taste, his head was turned. He began to collect and publish Scots and Gaelic, the two ancient indigenous languages of Scotland, Scots and Gaelic songs for a new era. His intention was, no doubt, to both preserve and promote the music of Scotland. However, in doing so, his tasteful adjustments may have eviscerated the vitality of his subject. Could this be the guarantor of its eventual obscurity? Beethoven provided nearly 200 arrangements over the years for Thomson. Many were listed as WOO. However, the best known of Beethoven's collaborations was 25 Scottish songs. This was published in 1818 and includes song texts by, among others, Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. This work has the formal recognition of being Beethoven's Opus 108. Burns was by then deceased, but Sir Walter was cresting the height of his powers and renown as one of the world's greatest writers. He was a key figure and a talisman of the Romantic movement. And so was Beethoven. At the beginning of Thomson's project, Burns had nearly always refused payment for his work, and it is unclear how much, if anything, Scott was paid. But Beethoven was definitely in it for the money, getting 3 to 4 Viennese ducats per song setting. George Thomson was a self-appointed guardian and promoter of Scottish, as well as Welsh and Irish, folk culture, and he was both the impetus and the link in all of this. Without him, none of this would have happened. Also, as patron, it was Thomson's own pocket that underwrote the costs of his beautifully produced and expensive musical publications. He himself paid Beethoven those considerable sums of money, today around $500 per song. These sums were transferred through the Viennese offices of the bank Fries and Company. For much of their relationship, folios of music and text had to be passed back and forth through a Europe torn by a Napoleonic War. They were smuggled through diplomatic channels. More than one copy was necessary to make sure that something arrived eventually, at either end. Whatever else we can say, Thomson's contacts were astonishing. Over the years, he enlisted the services of very many of the key figures in Scottish letters and utilised some of the greatest European composers available. Haydn, Pleyel, Hummel and Weber were all contributors to his project. But Beethoven was his star. They corresponded, most often in French, for years. The relationship had started before the high fame of Beethoven, when Thomson had been using the services of Haydn. When Haydn became ill and was unable to help, he recommended an up-and-coming composer called Beethoven. So what went wrong? Thomson's ambitions to have all of polite society playing Scottish songs in the drawing rooms was a noble one. He enlisted the very best collaborators. On paper, they are ideal for the job. But there were problems. In refining what he saw as clumsy rural or humble works for genteel company, he was maybe too keen to smooth out what he saw as rough edges. trusting rather to the fashions of the day. Even if that had been entirely appropriate, it would appear that those matters and manners of taste were not the stuff that endures, not as the original material had been. The guts and life force had been, perhaps, denuded. Beethoven's arrangements for piano, voice, and optional strings, violin and cello, were both technically challenging and intellectually advanced for a drawing-room audience of folk song. Thomson asked Beethoven to make the piano parts easier. This usually infuriated Beethoven, although he must have had some understanding of the market when he wrote in response to one such request that this was a less pleasant work for an artist, but surely good work for business. Thomson's obsession with the genteel probably consigned his project of nearly half a century of toil and payments to the dust of the musical archive. John Purser, in his seminal work Scotland's Music, has this to say: "In the late Georgian withdrawing room, talk of the soil was welcome, but the smell of it was not." Burns wrecked the words of Dainty Davy with successive revisions, cleaning it up for George Thomson's publications with their mostly unhappy arrangements of Scottish songs by Beethoven, Haydn, Pleyel, Kozeluth and Weber. These were the greatest composers of the day, but Scottish music largely defeated them. At the time, Sir Walter Scott felt pity for Thomson and said of him, "Last night George Thomson came to see how I was, poor fellow. He has talent, is well informed, has an excellent heart, but there is great eccentricity about him. I wish to God I saw him provided in a country kirk. That, with a rational wife, would, I think, bring him to a steady temper. At present he is between the tining and the winning. If I could get him set to any hard study, he would do something clever." Thomson aspired to be the greatest of all the Scottish musical collectors and publishers. That he failed in this is a tragedy of his Herculean efforts. He was undoubtedly a figure in his day. His Raeburn portrait, that mark of a rival in Georgian Scotland, shows what we might expect: a slightly nervous and fussy man. He had played his part with the greatest figures of the Romantic movement, but he had never really understood that, however passionate an inspiration to him, castrati are no model for romance.